Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second in an ongoing series put together by NetChoice on consumer welfare standard, antitrust law, and what the future seems to be for antitrust in our society and in the US. Now, today we've got an extra special event, and we're super excited because when we're talking about things like the consumer welfare standard, which is kind of one of the bases on which our antitrust law is not only built today, but has really grown and evolved. We've got two prominent people, one who was there at the beginning and one who helped develop it as it came forward. I'm Carl Szabo. I'm Vice President and General Counsel of NetChoice. And you can follow me at Carl Szabo on Twitter. You can figure out how to spell it later. But joining us today, very special introductions for Robert H. Bork Jr. He's the president of the Bork Foundation. He's the son of antitrust's most influential figures, Judge Robert H. Bork. Robert Bork Jr. heads the Bork Group, a virtual crisis litigation and public affairs agency. And before now, he was a journalist at U.S. News and World Reports, Forbes, Detroit Free Press, and many other places covering international economics. You can follow him at Robert_Bork_ Jr. And also joining us is Judge Douglas Ginsburg. Now, Judge Ginsburg was appointed to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia in 1986. He's a former chief judge of that court. He's currently a law professor at the Antonin Scalia Law School of George Mason University. He's a visiting professor at the University College in London, Faculty of Laws, and he's chairman of International Advisory Board of Global Antitrust Institute. Now, the way that this will operate is Mr. Bork will give an opening keynote, kind of the history of the consumer welfare standard and the reintroduction and republication of the Antitrust Paradox, the book that kind of started it all. And then Mr. Bork and Judge Ginsburg will sit down and kind of do a fireside chat discussion of antitrust law, its evolution, and the consumer welfare standard over the past 30 years. Towards the tail end, feel free to begin adding and asking your questions in the Q&A for those of you who are joining us on Zoom. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Mr. Bork to give his opening keynote.
Unmute. All right, I hope everybody can hear me. That's good. Well, thanks for that introduction. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to this audience. And as Carl noted, after a long process, we are about to republish the Antitrust Paradox, which has long been out of print. Books should be available on Amazon in April. It'll upset the secondary market where you can buy one now for $700, but these will be much less expensive. The new edition is special because it will include all of the elements of the two previous editions, plus a new introduction by Senator Mike Lee, who is a friend and champion of the consumer welfare standard. You can keep track of the relaunch by going to antitrustparadox.com and register there for information about when the book is coming out. And let me just say thank you again. I'm a little nervous about speaking to you today, not because Carl used a 15-year-old picture of me when I had hair and my hair had color, and not because NetChoice gave me top billing over the far more distinguished Judge Ginsburg, but because they said I was a decades-long expert in the field of antitrust. True confession, I am not a lawyer, although I play one on Zoom, but I did get a degree of sorts at the dinner table growing up. So I guess that counts for something. And I think because of that, I have a good insight into the antitrust paradox and the man who wrote it. My father is known to most people as that guy who didn't make it onto the Supreme Court. And some don't even know who he is. One high school student grumbled a few years ago on Twitter, "Who is Robert Bork and why is he on my government AP exam?" Well, I think maybe he's knows now, and a lot of people do. Of course, my father was much more than his Supreme Court nomination. In one particular area of law, antitrust, he was everything. When my father died in 2012, Professor Barack Orbach told the Washington Post, "Antitrust was defined by Robert Bork. I cannot overstate his influence." Any antitrust person would tell you the same thing. Perhaps we will differ on the interpretation of him, but Robert Bork is the single most important person in antitrust in America. Whatever happened in 1987 was insignificant by comparison. So how did it happen that a man many think of first as a judge and a constitutional scholar made arguably his greatest contribution to law in antitrust? Well, Professor Orbach explained it this way, and it's eerily similar to where we find ourselves today in this country. Professor Orbach told the Post, in the 1960s, Bork was concerned the socialists would take over the country through antitrust. He continued, antitrust was then about protecting small businesses. He built a framework about how antitrust should be more about economic efficiency than about helping small businesses. This was my father's impetus to write the book that would change America for the better and would contribute to 40 years of economic growth and innovation. I was in the 7th grade then, practicing math by adding up his students' exam scores as my father worked in his cramped attic study in New Haven to carefully develop and substantiate his concept of antitrust law. I have vivid memories of him. He had just turned 40 when he started work on this book, sitting at a desk that my mother made him from an old door, scribbling with his scripto pencils, mechanical pencils, on the blue-lined pages of his yellow legal pads. A cloud of smoke surrounded him from the Kent cigarette hanging from the corner of his mouth. This was before the beard. While I was practicing my addition and subtraction, my father was teaching himself calculus. He explained in an article about the same time, the specialist in antitrust should have as much command of basic price theory as specialists in other fields of law have of forensic medicine or tax accounting or the principles of chemistry. So my father taught himself calculus. The product of his labors was his masterpiece, The Antitrust Paradox, a policy at war with itself. The conclusion of his work was the profound declaration that antitrust law was designed to protect consumers. The Supreme Court had demonstrated this habitually by prohibiting price fixing, which is identified as maximizing the welfare of the consumer as the Sherman Act's defining principle. And yet, antitrust law had become a melange of conflicting decisions that tended to raise prices and support inefficient firms to the detriment of consumers. That was the paradox of his title. Post-1940, the court's antitrust jurisprudence focused on more exotic goals, restricting vertical mergers, tying products together, and other practices that my father's study of economics showed usually posed no harm to consumers. Thus, the court's findings directly contradicted the court's objective. Worse, he saw that antitrust law had fallen under the sway of subjective biases. Justice Louis Brandeis denounced the curse of bigness against small dealers and worthy men, the idea being that it was the job of the law to protect small, often artisanal firms against the predations of larger, more efficient firms. Justice William O. Douglas took up this cudgel in the 60s and 70s, thwacking businesses for being too big or too successful or too corporate. Robert Bork assailed this jurisprudence as early as 1967 when he took to the pages of Fortune magazine to criticize Justice Douglas for punishing Procter & Gamble for its acquisition of Clorox. Douglas's opinion was that the increased efficiencies had raised entry barriers, thus harming competition. My father met this kind of thinking with cool disdain. Like many antitrust opinions he criticized, Douglas's had no real economic analysis. There was no attempt to define raising entry barriers in actual economic terms. If the ease of entry is the hallmark of competition, he wrote, then it should be lawful for Clorox and its rivals to rig prices. After all, the higher the prevailing price of bleach, the easier it would be for outside firms to enter the market. What was getting lost here was the obvious question. Did the merger or acquisition or practice in question harm or benefit consumers? To provide the means to answer these questions is why I found my father studying calculus late at night. He believed judges have a duty to think through the real world consequences of their jurisprudence in terms of business and economics. Thus, the consumer welfare standard was born as the metric by which to apply a cost-benefit analysis to antitrust law by weighing those costs and benefits from the perspective of the consumer. There are those who wrongly attach a political description or motive to the consumer welfare standard, such as conservative, Republican, or pro-business. The consumer welfare standard has no political affiliation or ideology. It is simply pro-consumer. My father was equally critical of Republican and Democrat administrations when they misapplied or misunderstood antitrust law. That is why he was able to support the government's lawsuit against Microsoft when he thought a real harm to consumers had occurred. The antitrust paradox also advanced the view that judges should apply neutral principles with no slant against or for bigness or small dealers, or a magical ability to identify worthy men. Justice Douglas, who longed to become president, was perhaps the greatest example of what my father thought a judge should never be, a philosopher king on the bench. Robert Bork saw that if antitrust law was detached from consumer welfare, it would be free to pursue aesthetic and political goals at the expense of consumers and innovation. Worst of all, he saw the jurisprudence of his times, a dangerous anti-democratic principle arising. There is a kind of consumer democracy that Americans practice at the checkout aisle by voting with their dollars. Then there is actual democracy in the laws made by officials elected by the people. When judges use antitrust law to reorder business according to their personal whims or aesthetic principles, they degrade both forms of democracy. Antitrust law, detached from the consumer welfare standard, becomes a judicial Ouija board. It is apt to go anywhere and spell out anything, guided by the personal preferences of the judge. Such rootless jurisprudence allows judges to create new law, introducing a level of unpredictability into mergers and acquisition that stymies innovation, harming consumers. My father advocated for a principle validated by empirical research, supported by history, leavened with his dry, sardonic take on the state of the law. I can't think of any other book that changed the practice of law almost instantly. The first Supreme Court opinion to cite the antitrust paradox came just a year after the book's publication. From that moment on, the court explicitly adopted the consumer welfare standard as antitrust defining principle. And in 1993, the court cited the antitrust paradox in another case, even though my father was a lawyer representing the respondent in that case. As you can imagine, when the court cites you in your own case, you are almost certain to win, and he did. And so, for 43 years, the consumer welfare standard has been the North Star for adjudicating antitrust law in the United States. In a preface for the forthcoming 2021 edition of the Antitrust Paradox, Senator Mike Lee writes, Judge Bork's ideas stand out for their disarming clarity and near total victory. Returning to his seminal antitrust treatise over 40 years after its publication dispels any doubt. What he wrote as an argument for what the law should be now reads more like a penetrating exposition of what the law is. That is, until now. The common understanding of antitrust law's purpose is in danger of being replaced by theories that are even more vague, subjective, and politicized than they were before the book was published. We are seeing a renewed push to forget what we have learned and embrace what we once legitimately rejected. For example, recent lawsuits against technology companies supported by almost every state and the Department of Justice are rooted in an animus over size, resurrecting the old but discredited dogma of the curse of bigness. Government attorneys in both parties demonize multi-billion-dollar acquisitions as harmful to innovation, when such buyouts were allowed by regulators and have actually stimulated the desire for innovators to innovate. Proponents of a new antitrust standard ignore the benefits of economies of scale and network effects, which are the result of the choices of consumers who remain free to destroy corporate empires with a mere purchase or a click. Modern thinkers and practitioners are losing touch with how vital to democracy it is to have neutral judges enforcing a neutral standard. We all lose when judges replace the laws enacted by our elected representatives with their personal sensibilities. We also lose when we no longer accord respect to the votes consumers make with their dollars. Critics now charge that the consumer welfare standard has an obsessive focus on price at the expense of innovation and competition. This has never been true. The antitrust paradox established that a successful consumer standard bears many fruits in addition to low prices, among them innovation, output, abundant product choices, and quality. As my father wrote in his September 1969 Fortune article, economics provides one other lesson that should be written in red letters across the antitrust prosecutor's bathroom mirror. Injury to competitors is irrelevant to the question of injury to competition and consumer welfare. The only legitimate goal of our present statutes is the maximization of consumer welfare. Efficiency-motivated mergers deserve the law's protection. A market will penalize those that do not, in fact, create efficiency. These principles are now being jettisoned. What is behind this renewed wave of rootless antitrust action? Why is this happening now? Well, on the left, the new Brandeis movement is underway, articulated by Lina Khan and others. Ms. Khan says the new Brandeis movement isn't just about antitrust, rather, it's about values. Senator Amy Klobuchar has introduced into the 117th Congress a sweeping bill that contains many provisions to protect workers and consumers, spurring innovation and promoting economic equity. Once again, a body of law meant to defend consumers is now being adorned like the White House Christmas tree. It protects workers, it promotes equity, but somehow, and here is the jurisprudential Ouija board, helps us realize new and better values. Antitrust is in danger of becoming the Swiss Army knife of laws, only it will not open a single bottle of wine. Senator Elizabeth Warren, not to be outdone, would transform antitrust law into mechanisms for government to regulate any American business of any significant size. And she drew upon Lina Khan to come up with her plan to bust up big tech companies. So on the right, conservatives outraged by liberal bias by big tech are suddenly all too happy to join in this dilution of long-standing antitrust principles. Many are ready to throw out the consumer welfare standard and neutral principles in order to give Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos a little heartburn. So we live in an odd moment when antitrust law has become a kind of Tinder for politicians, matching one strange bedfellow with another. You like breaking up big tech? Asked Ted Cruz, Donald Trump, and Josh Hawley to Lina Khan, Elizabeth Warren, and Amy Klobuchar. Well, so do we. And they all swiped right. The result is as antitrust lawsuits against Google and Facebook, supported by both the Trump and Biden administrations, as well as by almost every state. Ken Paxton, the Texas Attorney General, who tried to overturn Joe Biden's election in the Supreme Court, is taking the lead for liberals like Letitia James of New York. As I was watching all of this unfold, I felt I had to do something to reinforce what we already know. We already know what works: a legal regime that has protected consumers for decades. So I established the Work Foundation and also the Antitrust Education Project and became a publisher, bringing the antitrust paradox back into print. I'm here today to defend the consumer welfare standard from this bipartisan assault. And I want to tell you, if you are a conservative and you're angry at Amazon for dropping Parler from its servers, or you believe there are serious free speech implications in Twitter's blacklisting of former President Trump, or you were angered when Twitter suppressed Hunter Biden's laptop story while not suppressing other stories, or if you are progressive concerned about rising inequality or the crushing of small business or the need for more civil discourse and quelling of extremism, I hear you. Your concerns are valid. And I say this: trust innovation. These technologies are still young. We are still finding our way. When upstart tech developers get billions for being acquired, the big incumbents are not choking off innovation. They are acting as venture capital funds for innovation, with the ability to quickly bring to market new services on the scale of network effects. We should have faith that innovation will be uncontainable. It will eventually explode today's paradigm. We have seen time and time again that if you have patience, the market solves problems. So we should trust time and innovation to trim today's redwoods as they trimmed Kodak or MySpace. With the rise of blockchain, AI, and the Internet of Things, it is only a matter of time before we will be talking about a transformed landscape, and I am sure a whole new set of thorny issues to argue about. But introducing more complexity and more lawyers into the market for a vague quest for values is a recipe for more inequality. It is not a path to growth. Remember, the Department of Justice once sued IBM for its monopolization of digital technology. Judge Bork called the effort by policymakers to foresee and game the future an economic extravaganza. Such extravaganzas will not only fail, they will also breed new horrors. To buy into antitrust as the answer to the shortcomings of society and our culture, to seek to enforce values and equity and other nebulosities, can only be to the detriment of consumers, innovation, and a free market. The consumer welfare standard works because it discards nostalgia, aesthetics, and other idiosyncratic notions in favor of what actually works best for consumers. We should continue, as Robert Bork taught, to rigorously analyze productive efficiency of a business in strictly economic terms of its impact on consumer benefit. That is the one value that counts. For almost half a century, courts have applied antitrust law consistently under one fair and neutral standard. It has been understood that the welfare of the consumer is the North Star and should always be the result of any antitrust ruling. That is why I'm proud to republish and represent the antitrust paradox to a newly skeptical world. Thank you. And now let's see, where's Judge Ginsburg?
All right.
There you are. I don't have a fireside for us to have a fireside chat. I apologize, but
Will you have a match?
yeah, we can do a lighter thing like at the concerts. So, Judge, I wanted to just offer you the chance, first of all, to say, do you have any comments about my speech? And if they aren't nice, then please don't make them. But go ahead.
Well, first of all, before I say anything else, I'll tell you that I will not comment on any particular cases. So if I agree with everything in your speech, does not include references to cases, at least pending contemporary cases. But I think what you said is an excellent summary, and maybe we can get into a little more detail on some aspects of this. But basically, the arc you describe is clear, one in which prior to the adoption of the consumer welfare standard, the Supreme Court, and they're necessarily therefore the lower courts, were in complete logical disarray in terms of bringing forth any consistent, defensible view as expressed in the antitrust cases. That changed very dramatically with the court's adoption of the consumer welfare standard, the Supreme Court's adoption, so readily after the publication of the antitrust paradox. It was really quite remarkable. But the court has been quite consistent, as you suggested, until this very day in adhering to the consumer welfare standard, sometimes expressly repeating itself, other times restating the matter in terms of the purpose being to preserve competition, not competitors, which was a hallmark of the Ancien Regime before the book, preserving competitors for a variety of ill-thought-out reasons. And the critiques that we're hearing now from, not from within the courts, of course, but from a variety of academic and academic and then outside public policy commentators, has been really an invitation to return to our old ways, to return to an era when it was really impossible to anticipate how the court would apply the antitrust laws, with one exception, as Justice White pointed out. The only consistency in the merger cases there was a plethora of them in the 60s, was that the government always won. That was not a very good way to develop jurisprudence, having multiple different, often one-off rationales, but at the end, the government always won. It wasn't exactly informative for business as to what they could and couldn't do, except that they might individually, some firms proposing a merger might find themselves struck by lightning when the FTC or the Justice Department steps in and say, no, for some reasons which are hard to explain, but we'll think of them, we oppose your merger. But of course, this is not just all about mergers. The consumer welfare standard has really been very influential with regard to Section 2 of the Sherman Act, not just Section 1, dealing with monopolization and attempted monopolization. So it's been really an extraordinary effect. I think others who we've quoted are correct that I can't recall, and I don't think anybody's aware of any previous situation where a book not radically, but so dramatically changed the thinking in an entire field of law, and not just in the U.S.
Other than being a great idea, why why did the book have such immediate and long-lasting effect, do you think?
Well, I think I've actually written about this, but it's been a while. But I think there were a couple of reasons. First, with regard to the court, I think the book really made it quite clear to the Supreme Court and Supreme Court clerks and everybody else around them that the old way didn't make any sense. I mean, in a way, the indictment in the antitrust paradox, like the indictment on the Declaration of Independence, in that case of George III, was a very important element of it because it deconstructed any possible adherence to the old way of doing things, and as well as offering a new and a coherent way of doing things. There was an interesting example of this very early on in the history of it all, in the Sylvania case in 1977. It concerned a vertical restraint. The Sylvania made televisions, and they had a contract with a retail dealer saying you can sell them only from a particular address in San Francisco and nowhere else. And the retailer, after some deterioration of relations with the manufacturer, opened a second store at an unauthorized location and was cut off. And that had been treated as a per se violation of the antitrust law. Any sort of vertical restraint like that, resale price maintenance, territorial restrictions, customer restrictions, were all condemned per se unlawful, no, without regard to the rationale and whether it was really sensible or efficient. And that came up from the Ninth Circuit, of course, from San Francisco. And the Ninth Circuit simply defied the Supreme Court's learning. They've done that a lot since then as well, but in that instance, and said that the legislative intent, I'm quoting them, underlying the Sherman Act has as its goal the promotion of consumer welfare. And we decline blindly to condemn a business practice as illegal per se, because it imposes a partial, though perhaps reasonable, limitation on intra-brand competition, when there's a significant possibility the overall effect is to promote competition among brands. The Supreme Court took the case, reversed themselves, and adopted the Ninth Circuit's view based on the antitrust paradox. So the court was clearly ready and hungry for reform. So why the staying power? And I think it's because the rationale, the consumer welfare standard had some very significant and almost immediate consequences for the world outside the court. And I must say, first of all, that the Academy uniformly disagreed with your dad's interpretation of the legislative history. Some significantly disagreeing with it, others saying, well, that wasn't consumer welfare wasn't the only concern. But there was virtually nobody in the Academy that embraced the thesis of the book insofar as it was based on the legislative history of the Sherman Act, which is a mess, I must say. One can look into it and find pieces of this and that. But the first thing I think for explaining its longevity is that it substantially ameliorated the uncertainty that had prevailed when courts were freely choosing among multiple incommensurable and even conflicting values. That was sort of captured even by one of the academic critics, Professor Grandy, who rejected his view, Bork's view of the legislative history, but went on to acknowledge that Bork's thesis provides a clear and cogent set of rules the courts can apply in antitrust cases, and no other view of antitrust accomplishes this task as well. Well, that's a tremendous insight. I mean, the fellow doesn't agree with the legislative history, but says this is the way to look at things if you want to have a cogent set of rules. So that's very attractive to not just to business interests, but to consumer interests, and to the courts. I mean, having a coherent set of rules is extremely important when you see them. Secondly, it substantially narrowed the range of conduct that could come within the condemnation of the per se rule, and introduced the rule of reason into almost everything. A huge change in the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court. And then finally, and why is that valuable? Well, it exposes the fact that the per se condemnation was condemning as unlawful things that were in most cases actually favorable to consumers, or at least benign. Just on vertical restraints, there's a meta study suggesting that 85% of all the instances that have been studied of vertical restraint, 85% of them were either benign or pro-consumer. Now, 15% were not, so you don't want to have per se legality, okay?
Right.
But it really pays. And when the court made that change, the number of cases over a few years dropped from 1,600 to 800. Those cases where you couldn't actually prove anything dropped out. It was so much easier when you didn't have to prove anything. And then finally, I think it put a visible end to the malleability of the antitrust laws in the hands of the lower courts, who could invoke almost any value. There's a passage by Justice Learned Hand from the Second Circuit, one of the most revered circuit judges in our history. And he wrote, Congress intended the Sherman Act to achieve certain socio-political aims. And then quoting him, helplessness of the individual, the organization of industry in small units. And then finally says the Congress had delegated to the courts the duty of fixing the standard for each case. Now that is not a rule of law. That is a mess. It is simply a rule of a regime of total discretion, which is bad not only for those who are regulated by it and for the economy, it's bad for the rule of law.
Well, with that, let me ask you this, because I think we're slowly getting to the point where we need to, or quickly getting to the point where we need to open this up for questions.
Good.
Let me ask you this. So with all of this mess that you describe and the success of the last 40 years of the consumer welfare standard, what's going on? Why are all these people trying to tear it down and substitute something else?
Well,
If you can answer that, I don't know.
Ascribing motivation is a risky proposition, but I think it's important to appreciate just how what shall I say, how loosey-goosey what they want to replace it with is, because that in itself is a reason to adhere to the consumer welfare standard. The most frequent complaint is about the size of large firms. You know, the big is bad, something we got behind, put behind us at the Justice Department in 1981 when Baxter, as the head of the antitrust division, just simply said, that's over. Big is not bad, bad is bad, bad conduct is bad, not being big. So that's, and of course, the rationale for opposing bigness is almost always these days that it tends to give large firms, or to result in large firms having undue political influence. But antitrust is an extremely haphazard way of dealing with that, just like using the tort system to redistribute wealth as opposed to the tax system is a very poor idea. So, and this is true of the other values as well. They're all, if the Congress really wants to pursue them, should do so through other means, not by distorting the antitrust regime. So here's Barry Lynn from the Open Markets Institute testifying before the Senate. He said the consumer welfare standard warps antitrust law by preventing its use for specific policy outcomes such as reducing inequality or raising the earnings of workers or fighting concentrated political power. Well, they're using the antitrust laws to reduce inequality is just plain stupid. I mean, it has nothing to do with inequality except in the most remote way, and even then on a haphazard basis. The antitrust laws just as much, probably just as frequently promote income equality. If you're going to break up firms to promote income equality, you're basically saying you want to make some people poorer in the hope that that will somehow make other people wealthier, which is quite a speculative undertaking. But the worst thing is this: these require trading off values against consumer welfare. And assuming that they don't totally junk concern with consumers, and no one proposes that I can see, they just want the agencies to incorporate other values as well. But that means trading them off. How much consumer welfare do you give up for the hope of some change in income equality, or for some environmental amenity, or whatever else it is that they're flogging? They're simply incommensurable, and there is no possible way to monetize both sides of that equation and decide which is the more valuable to our economy, or to the values that they're promoting. It's a fool's errand, frankly.
Let's turn to some of the questions that have come in. One is, and you could go on forever about this one, but could you talk about the influence the antitrust paradox had or didn't have in Europe? Clearly, they have a kind of different system over there.
Well, yes, it's much more concerned still with the preservation of competitors. In a decision of the European Court of Justice a few years ago, I guess 3 years ago now, maybe less, in the Intel case, this decision, which runs probably 800 paragraphs or something, says first, paragraph 702 or something, that really parroting our Supreme Court, that the purpose of competition law, as they call it, is to protect is to protect competition, not competitors. And then just a few paragraphs later, they say, but of course, there will be no competition unless we have competitors. And then turn around and start protecting competitors in the interest of competition. It's a little
Very
bit
clever.
bizarre. And that's an improvement over what they used to do, which was to not be concerned with consumers nearly as explicitly. But it is a different system, and it does incorporate definitely concern with consumers, but also with competitors. That and building a single market, making sure that there are not things that are offerings by firms that are available on different terms in different countries, which is understandable in view of the origins of the European Union, but now often frustrates efficient distribution systems.
Here's a question. There's clearly a shift occurring in the antitrust views of enforcement agencies and politicians, both Democrats and Republicans. Do you see any shift occurring in the judiciary too, or just in enforcement agencies?
Well, I'm not sure I see it in the enforcement agencies. Neither of our agencies has ever repudiated the consumer welfare standard. I don't know where that question comes from, the premise comes from. And of course, they have not brought any cases, nor are there any private cases that have induced a court to depart from the consumer welfare standard. So any of that, if it's on the come, it's going to be a long time coming.
Okay. Here's one that sort of mirrors what I was going to ask you about the future of the consumer welfare standard. There's clearly a shift occurring in the antitrust. Sorry, I read you that one. What's the best? No, that's not. Well, I see it twice here. Okay, so let me just ask you, what's the prognosis?
Well, two proponents of departing from the consumer welfare standard as the sole criterion for antitrust enforcement have been appointed to positions in the current administration.
Right.
Lena Khan as a commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission, whose nomination is yet to be confirmed, but I expect it would be. And Tim Wu, who both from Columbia University Law School. And Tim Wu has been nominated to a position, I believe, on the National Economic Council, but with an idea of his attending to competition policy, presumably internally as well as externally. And
we're still waiting for the head of the antitrust division too.
We don't know who the head of the antitrust division will be, who will be the chairperson of the Federal Trade Commission.
Right.
Those are the key positions. I think there is some danger in having a competition policy office in the office of the executive office of the president in the White House or West Wing, because I fear it will, even if inadvertently, politicize antitrust enforcement. As you recall, when President Trump was still campaigning for office, he proposed that certain companies be targeted for antitrust enforcement. At least one of them was a year or two later by the antitrust division. And although the Assistant Attorney General understandably said the case was brought on its merits and not because of what then campaigning and or then later President Trump had said, it was greeted with skepticism in some quarters, precisely because when the president says that, and then a subordinate of the president brings the case, it's impossible to dispel the appearance of political influence. And with somebody in the White House for competition policy, I think it's going to be very difficult. I hope Tim is up to it, to walk a line so that we don't have that sort of public impression created.
Can you handicap what you think is going to happen in Congress in attempts to modify the consumer welfare standard? Or is that outside your realm?
You know, that's a bit of a, I think I'd go to the betting websites if I wanted information on that.
Well, let's see if there's anything else here. Someone asks, Judge Bork once argued that antitrust laws would be likely to be void for vagueness without the consumer welfare standard. How alive is this concern with current proposals that we are seeing?
Well, these proposals, if they were adopted, if you had several criteria in addition to, or conceivably instead of the consumer welfare standard, we would be back where we were. And I wouldn't call it a rule of law at that point. I mean, it would be, because of these trade-offs of incommensurables, it would seem to, it would inevitably to be highly discretionary. And you know, there's a gulf between being highly discretionary and being void for vagueness, because the Supreme Court standard for void for vagueness are very indulgent. Let's say they've upheld regulation in the public interest as being an intelligible principle. And there's no sentiment I can tell anywhere for revisiting that anytime soon. Although I think it should be revisited.
I have a question here about the rule of reason. You had mentioned it when we were early in your comments. Do you think it's in danger?
Well, right now, the rule of reason means those things that are that condemn. Let's put it another way: the statute condemns every contract, combination, or conspiracy in restraint of trade. And it was 1897 when the Supreme Court, maybe earlier, looked at that and said, well, that can't possibly be true. It must mean every unreasonable contract, combination, or restraint, or unreasonably in restraint of trade. And what would change, I think, is not the application of the rule of reason, but the content of it. So you'd be saying, well, is it, I mean, it's hard to articulate even, if the goal is income inequality, was it reasonable for the agency to think that this practice that they prohibited was exacerbating income inequality? I mean, you can apply a rule of reason to that. I don't know what value it would have at that point.
Okay, well, maybe we should, are there any other questions here? Let's see. I think that's it, unless anybody wants to put forward another one in the last few seconds. Do you want to, is there anything you want to say to wrap up?
Yeah, I will. I mean, I'll summarize it.
Oh, here, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Can I just jump in there? This is a good question. What do you think about the proposals to condense antitrust enforcement into one agency? In other words, take it away from the FTC, give it solely to the Justice Department.
Yeah, well, at the risk of offending some of my friends at the FTC and alumni of the FTC, I do think it would make sense to have at least to bring the antitrust enforcement under one roof at the Department of Justice, and leave the FTC with its consumer protection function. Indeed, bring more consumer protection now is spread out among several agencies. And it would make a lot of sense to centralize it at the FTC. They're good at it. They're experienced with it. And we need, and the Congress is working on, a privacy regime, which is a form of consumer protection. And I think it would be folly to put it anywhere else than the FTC. But they have civil enforcement divided between the two agencies and criminal enforcement only at the Department of Justice, of course. It really makes no sense. No one would design it that way, writing on a clean slate. My colleague Josh Wright and I are writing a paper now for the Antitrust Law Journal on reimagining the antitrust infrastructure, if you will. And that's what we'll be recommending, among other things.
Carl, do you have anything you want to jump in now? There you are.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much, Mr. Bork and Judge Ginsburg. This has been a fantastic conversation. You've really managed to address all sides of the spectrum, whether you are an antitrust nut and definitely got a lot out of those conversations, whether you're a bit more of an antitrust newbie and wondering how the politics is going to play in, we addressed that. I really do think we got all of the issues addressed, and we now have two different publications to look forward to. Judge Ginsburg, you referenced the one that you and Josh Wright are going to be producing.
Right.
And then, of course, we can look forward to finally being able to get an affordable copy of the Antitrust Paradox.
Well, if you want to pay more.
How about this? We'll buy the book and then we can subsidize the Work Foundation independently. So with that, I want to give a virtual round of applause to our two fantastic panelists. I want to remind everyone that you can learn more about each of them online, as well as there's a lot more to discover at netchoice.org. And a copy of this recording will be available live on YouTube for your viewing pleasure. So thank you again, gentlemen. Greatly appreciate it. And I wish everyone a good and healthy rest of the week.
Thank you.